For the next few weeks, we're going to be studying qualitative research studies. Here's a word cloud that gives you a general idea of what kind of concepts are involved in qualitative studies. Our learning goals include knowing about the different kind of qualitative designs, knowing about their sampling techniques and how they collect their data and how they analyze their data. You're going to be able to practice being a qualitative researcher this week and choosing purposeful samples. I'm going to practice a little bit of coding data and visualizing data analysis techniques. And this will help you evaluate qualitative studies. So let's get started with just focusing on generally empirical research. And so we have a research question like, how do we know what works in education? We can go about it and by looking at qualitative or quantitative studies. So qualitative studies would be kind of like the forest, stepping back and looking at the big picture, where quantitative studies might be more like looking at the trees, so looking down on the forest floor and looking closely. Qualitative research is going to be using language and words and analyzing those, whereas quantitative research is using numbers to try to quantify our variables. The goal of quantitative research was to generalize to a larger population. We want to objectively observe and measure differences or relationships between variables. In quantitative research, we're looking for statistical and practical significance. In qualitative research, our goals are a bit different. In qualitative research, we want to describe and analyze in order to understand either behavior or thoughts or feelings, things that are hard to quantify. Now, we don't talk about generalizability with qualitative research, but we do use the word transferability because we can transfer the results of our qualitative studies to other similar situations, even though we will not be generalizing to a large population. So when we're looking at education and we're looking at evaluating knowledge, then we might use a Likert scale or something, or whether something is correct or incorrect, then we're going to be getting quantitative information. So like multiple choice tests, matching, Likert scales, measurements, those will all give us quantitative data. But if we want to know about whether someone understands something, we need to listen to them talk or see what they write. We need to hear what they have to say or read what they have to say. Can we exactly measure understanding with numbers? It's kind of hard to do. So that's when we would turn to qualitative research. And qualitative research allows us to take open-ended questions and analyze the results, or essays, or descriptions of behavior, observations of behavior, and we can take those rich textual descriptions or explanations and then analyze those to try to understand what our variables are about. So here's a quote I'd like you to think about. Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted. What do you think that means? Now, in quantitative research, when we're looking at participants, we were looking for large sample sizes in order to generalize to larger populations. And a large sample will reduce the statistical error. And we also talk about random selection, helping us with more reliability and validity and being able to generalize to those larger populations. So in quantitative research, we're looking for large sample sizes. In qualitative research, it's a bit different. because qualitative research is very time consuming to analyze the text, we have a limited sample. Okay, and because we have a limited sample, it's a small sample size, and this is not a detriment. This is not a limitation of qualitative research. This is just how it is. So we have to accept that it's going to be a small sample size. But we are able to transfer to others depending on how well the researcher explains what their research is and who's in the research. We can take their explanation and say, hey, this applies to my situation, or this applies to that teacher's situation, or this applies to whatever. So you can decide who this research applies to, even though we're not generalizing to a large population. But like I said, the data analysis is very time consuming. So for that reason, the sample is very purposeful. It's not random, and this is not a limitation. This is something that we don't do with qualitative research. We don't make a random selection. We're very purposeful. Since we might only have one in our sample size. We have to be very purposeful and say, we're going to choose this participant or these 5 participants or these 20 participants, whatever, for a reason. And so we're very purposeful with picking our sample. Both qualitative and quantitative research are both empirical research. So sometimes there's a misunderstanding that only quantitative research is empirical. The reason they're both empirical is that we have a systematic way of collecting data for both types of research. And then we have a rigorous data analysis process. We can replicate these studies, and they're peer-reviewed. So these are 4 reasons why qualitative research is empirical as well as quantitative research. Okay. So in a qualitative study, we still have similar process to quantitative study. We start out with our research question, and then we choose our sample. The difference is that we're going to be very purposeful in choosing our sample. We're going to practice some of this week. And then we choose the type of study we're going to use. How can we best explore this question? And then we collect data. This week we're going to do an observation activity. That's one way to collect data, is to observe behavior. But there's many different ways to collect data in qualitative research. Then we analyze the data in a very purposeful way, and that is what the most common way is to code the data. So we're going to do some coding activity this week to give you an idea of what that process is like and to show you how time-consuming that is. And then the researcher takes the coded data and they organize it and they create meaning for it and they draw conclusions about what the results of their study are. So here's another way of looking at those 6 steps. We ask a question, we pick those people that are going to be in our study, we decide what type of study we're going to do, we collect our data, we analyze our data, and then we draw conclusions about what the study came up with, what are the results. So we're going to start with talking about sampling. In sampling, we select the participants in a study. And sometimes in qualitative study, they're called participants. Sometimes they call them actors. Sometimes they call them subjects. So let's say this is our research question. I'm wondering how parents differ in their perceived roles in education across cultures. So the researcher, if this was my research question, as a researcher, how might I choose my participants? Remember, we're going to be doing this purposefully. Who might this researcher select as participants in the study? So let's talk about how this researcher might go about choosing those. One way of choosing that might be choosing a typical sample. So it might be a few parents that are in a typical kind of parenting family. So it might be a single parent family, or families with both parents, or parents who are active in a PTA. So I might purposefully say, hey, I'm going to go to my PTA and I'm going to choose, ask which parents want to be involved in from the PTA meeting. Or I might look at, parents with both, families with both parents are typical. I'm going to choose families that have parents, both parents in the family. Or we can have typical single parent families, and we might purposefully look at that and see what is the parenting role in parents with both families, families with both parents or single parent families. Another thing we might look at is extreme or deviant cases. So maybe we're going to say, I'm going to specifically study parents who've initiated a lawsuit against the school district and see what do they perceive as their role in education. Or I might look at a really wealthy or famous parent and see what do they think is their role in education. Or let's say parents from an Amish community that might be different from the communities around it. So that might be how I choose to study this phenomenon. And it might be different from how you might choose to study it. So you could choose in a different way. In qualitative research, we're very purposeful, and we're going to study this little part of this population of parents. We might say, hey, we want to have a variety of different types of cultures. So I might specifically say, I'm going to choose these 3 cultures or these 4 cultures, whatever, and specifically pick parents from these 4 cultures. And that would be a heterogeneous mix. Or I might say a homogeneous mix, and I might look within one culture and look for patterns within one culture. So I might pick 4 or 5 parents from the Latino culture and see how do they all perceive themselves as having a similar role in education. Or I might look for, we call this a critical sample or a rich example of a certain phenomenon. So in this case, I might look for parents who feel very strongly about what their role in education is. Or let's say I was when I was a tech integrator and we were studying how teachers integrated technology into their classroom. I specifically chose teachers who use technology well because I wanted to study what is it that these teachers do that other teachers can learn from in their classroom. So I specifically picked teachers who did a lot with technology. Or we can do something called snowball sampling. And this is when the participants recommend each other. So if let's say I do choose to look at Latino parents, I might choose a specific parent that I know who's Latino, and I might say, do you know others, or where else I can find other Latino parents? And they might point me in the direction of their friends, of maybe where they worship, or organizations they belong to. So one participant leads me to other participants, and that's called the snowball sampling. Now, when we're sampling, there's also 2 different kind of structures we can think about when we're choosing our sample. One might be confirming samples, meaning that we've done our research, our literature review, and we see some emerging themes or patterns, and we want to confirm whether this is really happening, and we pick samples that are similar to what we see in the research. Or we might specifically look at the research and say, I'm going to pick some parents who are different from what's in the research, and I'm looking for negative samples. For example, I might notice that there's a lot in the research about African American parents who are low socioeconomic, and I might say, hey, I am going to specifically look for African American parents who have a high socioeconomic status, and I'm going to study them. Or I'm going to study parents who are homeless and specifically see whether they what their role in parenting is. So we can look at to confirm what we already believe based on the research, or we can look at negative samples, case examples. So again, qualitative samples are going to be small sample sizes. So we're not going to say this is a limitation of the study. This is what we expect in a qualitative sample, that it's going to be a small sample size, that there's going to be a purposeful selection of participants. We're not going to choose them randomly. So again, this is not a limitation of the study. This is how qualitative research is done. Now, because it's a small sample size, it's the researcher's job to give us a rich description of how they chose their sample, their reasoning, and who is in their study. That rich description is then going to help us transfer to other situations that are similar and say, hey, this is just like my child, or this is just like this sample is just like this other situation, and we can transfer the findings of this, that if it works for this person or group of people, then it probably would work for this group of people because they're so similar. So that's why it's important for the researcher to really give a rich description of their sample. They don't need to randomly select. They don't need to have a large sample size, but they do need to be very specific with who's in their study and why they chose them. So let's think like a researcher. So here we have this research question. I wonder how parents differ in their perceived roles in the process of education across cultures. You're going to participate now in a sampling activity. So we're going to go to week 12. We're going to read examples on the document, and you're going to add at least one idea of your own. And then we'll look at the big picture and look at what do you notice, think, wonder about the sampling process in qualitative research. So here we are in UB Learns. We're going to choose the sampling activity. Click on this, and you'll get to this document. On this document, you're going to be able to type on this by putting in a text box. So you can put in a text box across any one of these. And so here's my example. Let's say I'm going to choose to focus on Latino and African American parents from single parent families and two parent families. And the reason is I'm looking for typical family structures from two different cultures. So that's my reasoning for choosing that. Now you're going to click in one of these and type in your name, what kind of participants are you going to choose, and what's your reasoning. When you're done, go up here where it says Save and choose Save. Okay? If there's others that are already on the document, then read what they have and don't repeat what they already have. Scroll down and pick a box for yourself. So now that you had a chance to try this for yourself and try to decide what group of parents would you pick, what do you notice and what do you think and wonder about this process of how a research chooses their sample? Now let's talk about data collection. In collecting data, there's several ways that we can collect data in a qualitative research. Here's 3 of the ways. One is we can analyze text. We can look at documents and discourses that already exist. So documents that are in an organization, we can look at policies and procedures. We can look at discourses. In other words, we could look at Twitter feeds. We can look at social media feeds, other social media feeds, and look at discourses. We could look at chat rooms. We could look at discussion groups, and we could analyze the text that way. We could interview people where we talk to them and we ask them. Remember, we're looking for understanding, so we go right to the actor or the participant and say, why did you do this? What do you whatever we're trying to do. If they're a parent, we can say, what is your role in education? How do you see yourself involved in your child's education? Or we can do observations where we could go into, say, a classroom. We could go into a discussion that parents were talking about their roles, or different things that we can do where we're going to be just observers and looking to see how people behave and writing it down and then analyzing what we observed. So there's different kinds of data and different kinds of studies. So there's an interview study. There's survey studies where we could give the participants surveys with open-ended questions. We can do observations. We could have a focus group and call people together. So if I was doing that group of parents, I could call those groups of parents together and sit with them as a group and say, what do you see as your role as parents? And that's a focus group. I can look at specific documents, and I can look at discourse, either text discourses that are already written, so a discourse is a conversation, or I could listen to people talking, and that could be my data. So notice that this data is different from quantitative data where we're going to get numbers. All of these things are going to result in pages and pages of text that we're going to have to analyze. And thus, this is where the time-consuming part comes, because there's going to be a lot of text to analyze. So we're going to practice collecting some data now. We're going to do an observation activity. So we're going to watch a video. We're going to go into a classroom virtually, and we're going to take notes on a document. So I want you to write your specific observations under the notice column. Try to not judge. When you're an observer, you're not judging whether something is good or bad or right or wrong. You're just noticing things. Like, I'm noticing that the teacher is frowning. I'm noticing that the children are excited. I'm noticing that whatever it is, what are you noticing? Just a fact that you're noticing, a quick fact that you're going to write down. Because when you're observing, you can't tell them to stop. I'm writing. You have to write as fast as you can. So you might want to even write on a piece of paper and then transfer it over to this later. Or if you type faster, then write on this document. Okay, the video is attached to this assignment here, this observation activity. And here's the document you're going to write in. And that document is going to, in this document, you'll notice you have this column of things that you notice. So just observe, don't judge what you're seeing, and just jot down as quickly as you can all the things that you notice while you're watching the video. And then after you watch the video, then over here, you're going to write, what are you thinking and wondering? Here's where you can make judgments, and you can ask questions. So the thinking and wondering comes later, after you notice. You won't have time to do this thinking and wondering during the observation. Okay, this is the video that you're going to be watching. So it's linked in that assignment, but it's also here on the slide. So if you're on the slideshow, you can just double click this and watch. So very interesting class with this teacher. What are all the things the teacher is doing to engage his students with active participation? So we're observing and looking for active participation. Once you're done, put in what you think and wonder on your sheet as well. So now let's think about that data collection process. What was your experience in watching that video and trying to take notes down as quick as you can? So once the researcher collects their data, so for observations, they probably would observe for an hour or so, and it might even be several times, an hour once a week for 5 weeks or something like that. So you're going to get a lot of data, because think about all of your notes. If we just did that just for a few minutes, and look at how many notes that you got out of that. So if you did this for an hour and you did it 5 times, can you imagine how much notes you would have? So when we go into the data analysis process, the researcher looks at all these pages and pages of text, and they have to somehow make sense out of all of this. Here's the information. Remember, we're trying to understand. So they have to organize this information. They have to sort through it. They have to kind of summarize it or do something. I'm not going to just hand all of my notes over to the general public and say, read for yourself. I'm going to see what meaning I can get out of it and help them so that I can explain to the general public, this is what the study found. So what they do is they read their notes more than once, and they start looking for patterns or similarities. And when you're reading through, you go, oh, this was before. Oh, I see. This is like this. This parent said the same thing as this parent. Well, this is different, whatever. So they look for these similarities, and then they make up codes. And they label these similarities and say it's a code. We label the data. And we read and reread the data again. And we put all of the data that's important into these categories, into these codes. And then we look at the codes and see the results of that. And then we write up what's the meaning of this. We might write up text about what was in each category. And we can summarize each category. And then it could be synthesized into bigger themes. So maybe several categories really belong to one theme. So as the researcher is analyzing the data, they might have several insights into, oh, these things go together. Oh, this all belongs together. So it's a lot of sorting and organizing. That's why this process is very time consuming. So we go through this process of coding first, and that is either real codes that already exist or we make up the codes as we go. Okay. And then we sort through all the data and we put the codes on the data and categorize the data and say this belongs in this code. Some things might belong in more than one code. Okay. Then we synthesize it and we start to put it together. So notice, the puzzle pieces here. We might look at all the codes and say these codes really go together into certain themes. And so we're starting to put the pieces back together. In analyzing, we pull it apart, and in synthesizing, we start to put it back together. And all of this may lead to a larger theory. Many times, qualitative research will lead to a theory or a model of understanding something. Maybe quantitative research might be future research that comes out of this. You might start with a qualitative study, which ends up with a model or a theory, and then you might have some quantitative studies that look further into this. But usually these theories are going to be abstract or general theories. So let's get an idea of what it's like to code some data. Your classmates did this in groups, so they chose these documents. But since you're watching this video, you probably weren't in class. So right-click on this, Coding Practice for Individual, and open that up. Now this is data that came from an actual case study when I was the director of the Williamsville Education Center, which is a teacher center. And in this teacher center, what we did was we provided in-service an education to teachers in the Williamsville School District. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to study how effective our in-services were. And one of the things that we did was we used money from the state to purchase equipment for teachers to use in their classroom for technology. And then what we wanted to know is this equipment making a difference in learning in the classroom? So we specifically decided to study this. So what we wanted to do, here's the purpose of our case study. We wanted to provide immediate and easy access to technology so the teachers would use it regularly. In the past, they used to borrow technology from the teacher center, and they would borrow it for a week and then they'd give it back. But we were thinking, you know what, this isn't really going to change learning in the classroom to just use it once in a while, once or twice a year. What would happen if the teachers actually had the technology in their classroom every day for a year? Would it make a difference? So we actually purchased the equipment for them to have in their classroom for the whole year. They were volunteers, so we put out an email saying, who wants to be in this study. You will get to use this equipment for an entire year in your classroom, but you have to give us some data back on how it's working. And then we went with volunteers, and we tried to pick teachers from all different buildings. There were 13 buildings in the school district. So that was how we chose our teachers. They volunteered, but more people volunteered than we had for equipment, so we had to choose from that. We tried to, have a max variation of elementary, middle, high school teachers. Then we gave them the equipment and we provided in-service courses to support the basics of how do you use technology. And we gave them in-service about what's effective pedagogy, which effective teaching strategies that we could use with this technology. And then they needed to provide our teacher center with some data on the effectiveness of these in-services and how they use the resources in their classroom. So there were several case studies that we did. So we took this concept and we ran case studies throughout a course of several years. So these 5 case studies, one of them we gave teachers document cameras. So this was at a time when it wasn't in every classroom. So those who wanted to use them would apply for this study. Another one was a Zoom digital recorder. So this was a voice recorder. We also realized that the smart boards that were in some rooms that were very expensive, the software was really the important part of that. And so if we gave teachers a wireless keyboard and mouse, which was much less expensive, they could do all of the interactive things that you could do with the smart board, but they could just use a wireless keyboard and mouse. So we had some studies that had to do with, we're going to give the teachers the wireless keyboard and mouse, we're going to give them in service on using this interactive smartboard software, and then see if it makes a difference in learning. We also gave teachers video cameras. So if they applied for the case study, they would get this video camera. This was in the days before everyone had a camera in their hand with their phone. So this was a big thing then, to have a little video camera. So we taught the teachers how to use Windows Movie Maker software, and we taught them how to use the cameras and how they might use cameras in their classroom for teaching. So teachers signed up for these case studies. They had their in-services, and then they came to these in-services, and some of us even went into the classrooms and observed them teaching, and then they had to fill out surveys in the middle and at the end of the year, as well as give student examples of work. So we did give them an end of the year summary survey. There was a high response rate. 94% of them responded to the survey, which was expected because they actually agreed to take the survey when they agreed to be in our case study. So this was a high return rate, which we expected. 2 of the survey questions asked them an open-ended question and said, how did this impact learning in your classroom? So how did the in-service courses impact learning, and how did this use of technology impact learning in your classroom? So we wanted to see, are our in-services effective, and we wanted to see whether providing them with their technology really made a difference in learning. So here were the 2 classroom impact questions. Has the technology changed your teaching in any way, and has the technology impacted learning in your classroom? So we asked them about teaching and we asked them about learning. Then we took all of the data that they gave us in these open-ended questions, and we needed to classify them into categories. So after reading through the comments in both questions, what I started to do when I was reading through this is I was saying, oh, the same categories were happening with teaching as learning. So we ended up putting the data together because we thought it was going to be 2 different things, but really they talked about the same types of things when they talked about their teaching and learning. So what your task is going to be is to read through, this is just a small sample of some of the data of what teachers wrote about how this impacted learning and teaching in their classroom. So we're going to read through these quotes and look for patterns or themes. And you're going to put your quotes here. So make a text box here and put your quote codes. So your codes might just be 2 letters or a word or something. So just start reading through this and see what kind of patterns are emerging for you. So let me give you an example. I can start to read and say, activities are more student directed. I can clear up misconceptions quickly. I don't know how I lived without it. I would not be without one in the future. I've gained the time back I used to use walking around to each student and showing details. It allows me to provide more immediate feedback. So see, I just start reading this. And as I'm reading through this, I might notice that some of the things kind of go together. So for example, this one says, I've gained the time back I used when walking around to each student to show details. And this says, it gives me more opportunities to have students type information without getting out of your seats. So both of those have to do with saving time. So up here in the code, I might just put the word time. And then for these two, I might write time. Not that I can't do another code, so that might also go with something else besides time, but these two have to do with saving time. So I would put the code time here and put that code up here. So then I would keep reading through here and see what other codes I might use to categorize all of this data. So you're going to read through that, you're going to put your codes here, and list what your codes are right here. Now let's see, I'm going to give you a link to the actual report that I wrote, which we're going to be reading at another time, but let's just look at the codes that I came up with when I read this data, when I was the researcher and I coded all this data. So you just saw a little glimpse of some of the data, but when I read all the data over and over, I came up with these codes. So this was for the school year of 2008-2009. And you'll be reading this for homework this week and writing what you notice, then think and wonder. But if you scroll down and keep scrolling, you'll see that here is the impact on teaching and learning, and here were the codes. All right, so the teachers said, some teachers said there was no impact on teaching and learning. So teaching is the blue and learning is kind of the purplish color there. Many teachers mentioned higher level thinking. Okay, so if you look at the numbers down here, this is about 20 here. So there were some of the teachers mentioned visual aids and multimedia. Notice that many of the teachers, so if you look at what was the biggest impact on teaching and learning, had to do with student motivation and engagement. So learning, look at how many teachers, over 50 teachers for learning and over 20 teachers for teaching said student motivation and engagement was the big impact there. They also talked about that it's flexible, that technology helps us provide different ways to learn, and it helps my classroom be efficient, and thus that time kind of thing, and effective. So here's what, just kind of a summary of taking all of that data that was pages and pages of data and summarizing it down into this one chart. And there's several other charts in this. You'll also notice in this study that I have these themes. And so for every theme, or every one of those categories, I explained the theme, said how many people mentioned it, and then I gave specific examples. And this is so that you would see why I chose that theme. Here were some examples of what went into that theme. So for this theme, student-driven instruction and ownership, here's some examples of what teachers said, and here's my description. Same thing for this. Higher level thinking, here's some examples of what they said. When it looked like this, I coded it for higher level thinking. So that's what researchers do. They summarize that data, they put it into groups, and then they describe each group and give quotes. That's why a qualitative research report is going to be a lot longer than a quantitative research report because they need to richly describe the data. Now, there's different kind of codes or processes for how the researcher might choose codes. One of them is this, what I'm describing here was a generative code. I didn't walk into that room to analyze that data and already have codes in my mind. I started reading through it and saw the patterns, and the codes emerged from the data. So it's like, oh, they're talking about motivation. Oh, they're talking about, multimedia. Oh, they're talking about effective classrooms. So it came from the data. That's called a generative code. But remember I said we did this study over and over. The following year, I used those same categories because they came from previous research. So those are called priori codes because the codes already existed from previous research. So now I'm just going to go at the new data and use the previous data or previous research codes and code the new data with those codes. So again, the researcher might choose to look at the data and see which codes emerge from the data or already have in process a system of codes they're going to use to analyze the data. Okay, now, let's think about generalizability. Remember I said that we don't generalize the results of our study. So here's an interesting study that was done about generalizability in qualitative research, misunderstandings, opportunities, and recommendations for sport and exercise sciences. So I thought that was kind of interesting, but let's just go through why we can't generalize and what we can do to apply the research results to other situations. So as you might have just gotten a glimpse about the time-consuming process of data analysis for qualitative studies, their sample sizes are generally very small. And for this reason, we have to be extremely purposeful in selecting our participants. So we have this small sample size. And it's not like in a quantitative study where we're looking to take that sample and generalize to the larger population. We look for that large sample size. We look for statistically significant results so we know that it's not due to just chance. We look for random sampling, but that's not going to happen in the qualitative study. In a qualitative study, rather than generalizing from the sample to the large population, we talk about applicability. So I can apply this to my patients. So maybe I observed and interviewed several patients that have a certain situation, and maybe whatever they tell me can be applied to other patients who are in a similar situation. So that's why a researcher is going to use rich description so that as maybe I'm one of those patients or I have a loved one who's one of those patients and I want to apply what I'm reading to them, I want to have that rich description so I can say, oh, this is like me or this is like my mother or whatever. So that's why we can apply it to other situations, but we're not going to use the word generalize. So it might be a naturalistic generalization where we say, these results resonate with my personal experience. So that's kind of emerges. It's a feeling you get like, oh, this applies to me. Or we might use a kind of generalization called transferability, where one teacher is saying, hey, my study shows that this reading strategy worked with these elementary students with autism. And other teachers might read this and say, hey, I can adopt that idea and use it in our school because we have some students who are similar. Or a teacher might say that overlaps with my classroom, so I'm going to try it with my students. So this is called transferability. Or another kind of generalization is analytic generalizations, where we look at this and we say, oh, these results support a theory that's already established, or these results help to develop a theory that will be significant in the future. So here, because of this research, this theory emerged. Now I can use this theory and I can do other kinds of studies that might be qualitative or quantitative. And so I'm going to generalize it to future studies. So that's called analytic generalization. So the researcher's role here is to provide their readers with details to help them generalize the results or apply the results to other situations. So the researcher should provide quotations if they did interviews. They should provide some of their observation field notes with specific details about what they saw. They should provide some visual material if possible, some contextual details. They need to tell a story. So a qualitative research tells the story. And that's where, through story, they can bring others into this feeling of, oh, this can be used in other situations. So qualitative researchers are storytellers, but they're not fiction storytellers, they're nonfiction storytellers. But the interpretation depends on the lens they're looking through. So different researchers will come at this research with different lenses. One lens is called an emic lens, and that's when the participant is, or the observer is right part of the study. So it might be the teacher is right in there. So she's observing her students. So she's a participant observer, where the researcher is part of the group that they're studying. Or the researcher might be a non-participant and be outside of the group, come into the room and sit in the back and be a non-participant observer. And that is from the lens that's called etic. So we can look at this kind of a continuum here of emic, where the researcher is involved, and the etic, where the researcher is not involved. So think about in the clubhouse or outside of the clubhouse. If you're in the clubhouse, it's emic. If you're outside of the clubhouse and looking in, it's etic. And we have these different types of studies. One is called a phenomenological study. This is really a fancy word for an interview study. And so in a phenomenological study, we might interview a person from a specific group. Like, what is it like for you to be a new student in this school, or a new job, or a new club? And we might interview, specifically say we're going to interview new students. Okay, that's a phenomenologic study where you go into the clubhouse and talk to those people. Here's an example of a phenomenological study. The researchers went into schools and they interviewed LGBTQ youths about their experiences with using the bathrooms in the school. And this was a walk-along interview where they would take a walk with the students. This was also a good example of a snowball sampling, because one youth might tell about another youth that could be interviewed. So that's an example of a phenomenological study. Another kind of study is called symbolic interaction. And in this study, we're looking at non-verbal kind of communication. So the interviewer might be going into a situation and watching, facial expressions, watching behavior and how people behave. And they're looking for, this symbolic interaction when someone rolls their eyes or does something that's not verbal, and they're going to write this down. So they're observing this body language or unspoken kind of communication. So here's an example of one where teachers went in to look at classes and Researchers went in and looked at classes and looked at teacher expectations and how they treated the students in their class. This was actually a very disturbing study, a very upsetting study for me, because they specifically treated some students very poorly in their classroom, where they treated other students very well. And it really had to do with how the students were dressed, or if the students came in and they smelled different, or they were from a lower socioeconomic group, which you could tell. And it really, it was very disturbing of how teachers over the years really put these kids into categories and treated them differently. And that would be a symbolic interaction study, where the researchers were looking for the body language of the students and the body language of the teachers, and what happened in those classrooms with students' ability to read specifically. Another type of study is a critical theory study, where you pick a specific group and we look specifically at that group for something that's happening. Maybe it's a political thing that's happening in the group. So it might be looking at, say, a study on a foreigner's view of America's immigration problem. So not just from Americans' point of view, but maybe go and interview or collect data from people who are immigrants who are coming into America, and we want to find out what their view is. This would be a critical theory study. Another critical theory study that was done was a researcher who specifically interviewed ESLO teachers and wanted to find out what their viewpoint was about the students they were teaching and how they were viewed as an ESLO teacher. And then we have grounded theory studies. In a grounded theory study, this is when we have those generative codes, where we generate the codes. So we start with observation, look at, through those observations, when we look for patterns, and then we have a tentative hypothesis, which leads to a theory. So this is grounded theory, where the data helps us come up with the theory. So here's an example. In this study, there's a whole really good study here about mapping the process of grounded theory analysis, and it was a study about qualitative research, and it talked about what's the process that researchers go through when they are creating these theories. So it looked at several qualitative studies and went through this process. So that was a really interesting study. But their theory of how grounded theory happens came from looking at grounded theory studies, and then they looked for patterns of what's the process that grounded theory researchers went through. So think about this from the ground up. That's why it's grounded theory. It comes from the ground, and these theories emerge from the ground. We don't know what they are already. Here's another example of a study that so you can see here that findings revealed an emergent theory of student of color learning experiences in the multicultural course pedagogy, and it talks about implications for counselors. Another type of lens that we can go through is the conceptual framework lens, where you already have a theory or a conceptual framework, and then you're going to use that to analyze the data. So, for example, one of my theories is about that people have different thinking preferences. So I might then collect information from people about their thinking preferences or about learning in general, and then I might organize that according to the three thinking preferences that I've already identified. So that would be a conceptual frameworks study, or anytime the theory is already there and we're confirming the theory. That would be a conceptual frameworks. So here's another example of a conceptual framework study. So they specifically looked on Facebook, and they looked for conspiracy beliefs, a distrust in information sources, and endorsement of CAM. And those are the things they were specifically looking for. So this was they were confirming the theory that was already there, or maybe disconfirming it. This theory was a grounded case theory, the one that we kind of looked at today, where we're looking at how does technology enhance learning. So the first year that we conducted this, it was a grounded theory because we didn't know what the categories were going to be. So you're going to actually read that study and annotate it. And when you're reading through it this first time, you'll write a report on it later, but now you're just going to read it and annotate it. And these are the kinds of things you're going to look for. Highlight the things you notice, and then what are you thinking and wondering as you're reading it? Now, it's going to take a little more time to read these studies because they're longer because there's so much text, but you don't have to worry about statistics. So in one way it's easier, in another way it's going to be a little more time consuming. But so you're going to look at things like how extensive was the literature review? For this particular study you're reading, there was no literature review because I was doing a case study, and we didn't need a literature review. We specifically wanted to know whether those things worked in the classroom. But look to see what the research question is. What are their methods and procedures? How did they collect their data, analyze their data? How did they choose their participants? The sampling procedure. Was the data triangulated? Did they look at it more than one way? What were the themes? Do the quotes support the themes? So the researcher will say, here were my themes. Do these quotes, would you pick those themes? Do they go with that? When you're reading through this, highlight a few memorable quotes that you thought really resonated with you. Then look at their results and, ask yourself whether what did you think about the conclusions or insights regarding those themes? Do you agree with the researcher that those insights make sense based on the themes? They might give you some descriptive statistics. There's not going to be inferential statistics, but they might describe their data and say, this many people said this many people said that. So there might be some just those kind of statistics where they'll give you that information, but that's how they might summarize their data. If a lot of people said a certain thing, then they might give you some descriptive kind of statistics. And there might be some charts and graphs that help to summarize those results. And then look for limitations. Remember, limitations aren't that it's a small sample size, because that's what's expected. And then, can we transfer this? Who might benefit from this? So who could you transfer this information to? And then look for future research. What are some implications of this study? So what might this lead to? Is there a theory? Is there something here that the researchers discovered that can lead to future research? And that goes with, so what? Why does this matter? Why did they do this research? So those are the kinds of things you're going to annotate and think about while you're reading the study this week. So in week 12, you'll see there's a link there to the study itself that you can read, and then here's that guide to annotating so you can see the things that I had on the previous slide. If you have any questions, please contact me.